This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. With the hubbub of the season behind us, we thought it would be interesting to turn our attention to having conversations with some of the more important critics on some of the more, what we say, eternal issues. So anyway, here to introduce our guest, Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
Clive Barnes has been the chief drama critic for the New York Post for 28 years. For 12 years before that, he was the chief drama and dance critic at the New York Times. He's had a great career in the 20th century reviewing shows and having all sorts of opinions about journalism and the theater. And we have him on tonight to sort of take us back through his life in the theater and in journalism. Clive, it's a pleasure to have you here on Theater Talk.
Thank you, Michael.
I get the sense, talking to you over the years, Clive, that you were practically born a critic. From the cradle. I mean, you didn't want to be a playwright, you didn't want to be an actor or a director. I mean, you started reviewing at, how old were you when you wrote your first review?
I was about 18, 19. But I very soon found out that I wanted to be part of the theatre. I started to go to the theatre about the age of 12, 13, 14, something like that. 12, I suppose, really. And,
were you in London then, living in London?
Yeah, in London. I didn't come here until 1965. The accent isn't a fake. It's I once had a taxi driver who said, "That voice." It was when I used to broadcast. He said, "That voice, I know that voice. You're Clive Barnes, aren't you?" And I, modestly, I said, "Oh yeah." And he said, "Tell me, that accent, what is it? English, gay, or just affected?" Well, anyway.
What did you answer? All three.
Well, what can I say?
Yes.
But now I very soon realized that I had no creative talent whatsoever. And I wanted to be part of the theatre. I couldn't be an actor because I stuttered. I had a kind of impenetrable stutter until I was... Actually, I didn't really lose it. I still stutter occasionally, but I didn't really lose it until I was about 30. And, you can't have stuttering Hamlets. They make the play far too long. So my options, I never knew what directors did. I don't know that I even know today. And really, it was, I suppose, either a question of being an agent or something like that, or being a critic. And I wanted to be a critic. I enjoyed writing about theatre and writing. I suppose when you start to go to the theatre a great deal, you have very fixed opinions and usually very firm opinions. Sometimes you want to share them, and I suppose that was the idea. But I wanted to be part of the theatre.
When you were young in London, were you an avid reader of critics? I mean, who was the sort of major figure on the scene?
Well, I suppose the major figure was James Agate,
yes, sure.
who was
great writer. He
was on the Sunday Times, and he was rather a pompous kind of critic. I suppose every generation thinks the generations before are pompous, but Agate really was pompous, and. There were other people like Ivor Brown, and but there were. It really wasn't until Ken Tynan came along that, and of course the terrifying thing about Ken Tynan was he was exactly my age, and that was not a very encouraging thing to be a drama critic. I think that's why I started to become a dance critic. but well, actually, we wrote for the same university magazine. But Tynan was a formidable critic right from the beginning. He was a wonderful writer. And I sort of I feel I drifted into it, just lucky, I guess.
And you worked in some London newspapers at first,
Yeah,
right?
I worked at the London Daily Express and the
Was it a lively
London
scene
Times.
then, the London theatre scene?
Yeah, the theatre scene was much as it is now, actually, except that it was the scene as now. It's more like Broadway, but the scene as now, but with not the big institutional theatres. There was no National Theatre, there was no Royal Shakespeare Company, of course, there was no Royal Court, and there were no plays either. So, there were drawing room comedies and very polite little...
These were the kind of things that Tynan was smashing and making fun of and trying to tear down.
And he was perfectly right. But from 1956 onwards, with the advent of John Osborne and Look Back in Anger, things changed radically, and the whole situation was very different from that.
Now, as you were making a name for yourself, I guess, as a critic in London, how is it that the New York Times then came across you and brought you over and turned you into, for a long run, the most powerful drama critic really in the world?
Well, that was, again, a matter of chance, really. They first hired me as, at least I think they first hired me as a dance critic. John Martin had been the New York Times dance critic for years and years and years, from 1927 onwards. And he retired, and his successor, it didn't work out particularly well, and after about 3 years they needed someone else. They needed someone about the age of 40, I was 38, and they needed someone who was, they had very strict, they wanted someone male, about 40 and straight. Now, and a dance critic, and there weren't any in America. They literally had to import.
When they say straight, I mean, you knew that they wanted someone who was a heterosexual.
Yes. When I wanted a number two dance critic, this was made. It was made with great delicacy, but and lots of ums and ahs, and we don't hire people. We like to hire family men, you know.
Oh my God!
This was.
Now, when did this change?
This was about 1966, and
this was the New York Times.
It was the New York Times, and I felt like saying to the person who I was talking to, who shall be nameless, but he was very important at the time, I felt like saying, would you like me to go out into the newsroom and bring you in some of those kind of rather dubious people that you don't hire? but anyway, it was, so anyway, but there wasn't anyone suitable at that time, as they thought, and they looked around and did, you know, the sort of searches. And then they were having enormous difficulty getting a drama critic. I mean, I didn't really want to be the drama critic. I was quite happy doing dance. And I didn't want to give up dance at that point. And as a result, I kept on saying no to them. They kept on saying yes, and they would get someone. They got Kaufman, Stanley Kaufman, who he was an admirable man, but he didn't really work out. And then Walter Kerr, and he really wanted to do Sunday Law. He didn't. Well, anyway, the result was that I found myself facing the end of a barrel of a gun, and them saying, you know, it's now, you know, you've got to do it. So I did it, and I loved it.
But you took to it, yeah. Now, this is a different time, just in how you reviewed. Yeah. Nowadays, you have, you know, 3 or 4 days. You go to see a preview of 3 or 4 days. You were reviewing at a time when you went, what, had 45 minutes, 50 minutes? Can you sort of
45, about
take us through a typical Clive Barnes opening night in the 60s on Broadway?
It was mad. First thing that they started early, well, they still do start fairly early, but they would start about 6:30, 7 o'clock. So, and you would be usually out of the theatre. You would hopefully be out by 9:30. You'd certainly be out by 10. So in fact, we had more time. But you had to get to the paper, which wasn't too bad because you could walk to the paper normally, and then you had to write. You were very much at the mercy of your opening paragraph, because you typed away, and they took the pages, copy boys took the first page and set it up in print.
So there was no chance as a computer to sort of go back and revise?
No chance at all. And there was no chance to do any reference, you know. You either, I mean, I always remember reviewing, we're going back to Hamlet again, but I always remember reviewing Ellis Rabb's Hamlet. And to my horror, I always used to, even a Shakespeare play, I would try to read before, and you know, just to, you know, find out who died in the end and that kind of thing. But I suddenly realised that Rabb was doing all sorts of funny things. That he was using the first quarto and the first folio and mixing them all up. I was in a complete haze. I knew that someone had to sort this out, and it had to be the Times. The other newspapers wouldn't. So it was, and I was carrying all this in my head, but it was. There was no, my point is there was no time to do reference books or anything like that. You went to that typewriter very naked, and the takes were taken away, and you had to have it all finished by 11 o'clock. And then you would go upstairs and you would do your own proofs. The proofs would come through and you would, you know, correct them. And then I would normally go down again and do a broadcast, a WQXR review, 1 minute, which was actually different because it didn't work to just cut down the print notice. You really had to, it was a different format, a different style. So it really was, yes, it was quite hectic.
Did you ever sweat the deadlines, or you were just a sort of creature of deadlines? And
I was a creature of deadlines, and you got used to it. And I'd always had deadlines in London, you see.
Right.
I mean, on the London Times and on Daily Express. And I mean, sometimes in London, one actually used to pick up a telephone and just dictate without notes or without, you know.
really, you could, and you could do that,
head.
do a review
Yeah.
off the top of your head over
Yeah.
the telephone?
Yeah.
Now, you changed some of the style of the New York Times. I believe you were the first person in the Times to use the first-person pronoun.
Indeed.
But you didn't tell anyone you were going to do this.
No.
And there was a sort of, this was a, you forget now, this was a major thing, though,
Yes,
that the New York
it was.
Times
It was
actually
a big
published a
thing.
review in which someone said I.
Yes, it was a big thing because they always, at first I prepared the ground. There was a review of Jerome Robbins in the Interplay, a ballet, and I prepared the ground by saying in our review of yesterday's review, our wife now informs us that the setting was pink rather than red or something like that. But
Our wife.
I used our wife, and I thought, well, are they going to let this get away? They did. So I thought, well, I think about 2 or 3 days later, I used very daringly I. Then I rushed upstairs to see whether it was there or not. And I then rushed home and sat by the telephone. I told my wife what I'd done, and we all sort of got very nervous. I sat by the telephone, fully expecting Clifton Daniel, who was then the managing editor, to ring me up and say, you know, what the devil are you doing? This is and nothing. So I thought, oh. And I didn't hang around to get the edition. But the next morning I rushed out to get the edition, and yes, the I was there. And I thought, well, someone's going to say something. Nothing, not a peep. So about 3 days later I used I again. Then I used I again. And slowly I just started to use I. And other critics, such as Harold Schoenberg, who was our music critic, then he was a marvellous music critic, he always used to say things like, circumlocutions like, in this critic's opinion, or from this corner, whatever this corner was, or whatever. But eventually, everyone more or less came around to
Did you enjoy the power that you had at that time? I mean, the Times drama critic is always very powerful, but really back then you were
very
famous.
powerful.
You were on television talk shows regularly, and that was a big job.
Yeah, no, I don't think I didn't particularly notice it. I didn't take it especially seriously. I think it was lucky that I didn't take the newspaper as seriously as most people did, because I didn't think it was a very good newspaper. I compared it to the London Daily Telegraph. I didn't think it was nearly as good as the London Times, and it wasn't at that time. It's a much better paper now, incidentally, much better, and the cultural coverage is infinitely better than it was. Perhaps it's not quite as good as it was at one period, but you know, there was a period where its cultural coverage was really superb. I don't think it is quite so good now. But when I joined the paper, the cultural coverage, I didn't take the paper that seriously. Not having been born in New York. Everyone born in New York thinks, oh, New York Times, oh. But not having been born here, I just took it as another newspaper. And I just didn't think too much about the power. It was you know, it didn't strike me as particularly odd at the time. I think it would now, perhaps, but you know, because I never took the power side of it very seriously.
But the people you were reviewing must have. I mean,
yes, they did. I mean, obviously, but even so, and I'm sure that any of my successors, I'm sure that Ben would say the same thing.
Ben Brantley.
Ben Brantley would say the same thing. The power of the Times is always traditionally been overspoken. I mean, yes, certain shows. I mean, for example, if Ben Brantley had not liked The Pillow Man this season, it would have died a death.
Right.
If he had not liked Democracy, it would have. It did die a death, but it would have died a much quicker
It would have been a
death.
faster death.
But it wouldn't really matter. The fact that he didn't like Spamalot won't make much difference to Spamalot. The fact that he did like, I think he liked Caroline or Change.
No, he didn't.
He didn't like it. Oh no, he didn't. Someone else did.
He didn't. Frank did. But let's see.
Yes.
But what's one where he liked it?
But there have been examples.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that there were always many shows.
Wonderful Town with Donna Murphy.
Well, yes.
There are always complaints though, about the Critic in that job. What were some of the criticisms leveled against you when you were at the Times?
Always that I was English.
Really?
Oh yeah, always. I mean, this was an obvious. People always attacked. I mean, they attacked Walter Kirk because he was Catholic. I mean, you know, I mean, any Achilles heel they could see,
right,
they would grasp on.
Yes, and there were famous exchanges that you didn't understand the American artistic sensibility.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, in actual fact, it must have seemed very odd for someone with an English accent to, but in fact, by that time, particularly in England, after World War II and during World War II, the two cultures had become so intertwined that I knew as much about American popular culture as anyone would in America, but it was different for Americans who didn't know nearly as much about English popular culture, so they would make this reversal. But there were many attacks, but I mean, for example, David Merrick he used to make the life of the Times critic, if he could, absolute misery. He once so terrified Howard Taubman, it is said, he walked up and down outside the grill room of the Plaza. And poor Howard was so intimidated that he got a waiter to take him through the back entrance, through the kitchen.
Did he scare you?
What? No, he didn't. He first sent me, after I wrote one notice, I'd been in the job about 2 weeks, and he suddenly sent me this telegram. It was the day of telegrams. He said, the marriage is over, David Merrick. And even before I wrote my notice that night, I knew I had to do something about this. So I immediately arranged to send him back. Dear David, didn't know we were married, didn't even know you were that kind of a boy. Clive Barnes. And I arranged that to be sent to Variety as well. So that, and I set the, you know, I desperately showed that I wasn't going to be intimidated by anyone. And in actual fact, Merrick came round rather nicely, and we quite often had lunch. And
really, now could you do that in that day? I mean, you were the drama critic of the New York Times. That would be looked on now for the chief drama critic of the Times to be having lunch with a producer. But were you friendlier? Was it a different world then? You could be friendlier with the people that you covered.
I could. I mean, I always took the line that I could cut my grandmother's throat. and often did. I always felt that was the function of a critic. I mean, I never sought people out, but I used to, you know, often buy Merrick lunch. I wouldn't let him always buy me lunch, although in actual fact, if you can be bought for the price of a lunch, you're very cheap.
Now, why did your reign at the Times come to an end?
Why?
Yeah.
Who knows? I mean, I think perhaps it was felt that 10 years was enough.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel that I didn't get on very well with Abe Rosenthal.
Who was then the very
Who was
powerful
then,
editor
but
at
he
the
had
Times,
just moved in. He was getting more and more powerful, and by that time he was, I think he was the executive editor.
Mm-hmm.
And we never got on. And as soon as he ascended the throne, as it were, I could tell that my days were over. And Rupert Murdoch very soon wooed me, and Rupert's editor at that time, Roger Wood, we were...
Rupert was on the New York Post.
Well, he was on the New York Post. And Roger had been my editor at the Daily Express, and also we had been at Oxford together, so I went a long way back with Roger. And Roger was always asking me to go to the Post.
And offering you a pretty substantial amount of money.
A very, very large salary increase. And in the end, I was more and more interested, but it wasn't my choice. I innocently told Rosenthal, I said, you know, you ought to know that. And I wasn't trying to hike up my own salary, because they were trying to hire a number of Times people. So I told Abe this, and Abe was... But what he didn't tell me was that he was planning to can me anyway. It would have been nice if he had. So that, in fact, he didn't actually can me. He said... you know, I'll just do dance. So this time I wasn't prepared to do that. And so I went back. At this point, I said to Roger, I think the time has come. But by this time, Rupert did not give me what was originally offered.
Oh. What was his line? He had a line. What was his
What?
line? He had a funny line. He said,
I forget what
Well, he cut
I'll
his own
take it, but you're not worth what I was going to pay you before, because you don't have the Times job.
Yes. I mean, because he didn't, it was quite true, because from his point of view, it was absolutely, it was not the coup that it would have been.
Right.
It was a certain coup, because the idea of someone moving from and certainly the Times was very surprised. But I felt that even if I'd stayed on as dance critic with Abe there, I felt that my days would have been numbered. That once my kind of reflected glory as the drama critic had gone, I would then have been a lame duck and very vulnerable,
right,
just to have been farmed out to obituaries or something like that.
Having spent your life as a critic, would you, at this point now, encourage anyone to become a drama critic? Do you think there are jobs left for people? Is it a...
Certainly if they wanted to make a living, I wouldn't. But on the other hand, it's a lovely job. Yeah. If you love the theatre, you're being paid, not a great deal, but you're being paid to follow your hobby. And actually, to be honest, I've been very well paid. I must give Mr. Murdoch credit for that. He's done pretty well by me.
Well, it's the one job in newspapers where you always know what your subject is.
Indeed. You never have to think of anything. You just say, I was, and then you take it from there.
Right. We've only got a minute left, but what was your favorite musical this year? Tell me, and why.
Spamalot.
Spamalot. Well, I guess you're the only drama critic who voted for it.
Yeah, I think either Spamalot. No, I didn't vote. I voted for Dirty Rotten Scandal.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, no, I think probably either Spamalot or Dirty Rotten Scandal. I enjoyed both of them.
What was the worst call you ever made when you were knocking the review out overnight? Did you get anything spectacularly wrong?
Well, what is wrong? You know, you always think you're right, and the other people were wrong. So I mean, you know, obviously, I gave bad notices to things that ran for years.
But you may have been right.
But, you know, I was possibly right, and, you know...
But you never had the one where the one critic who panned the glass menagerie or something?
No, I don't think I was ever the... I don't think I was sometimes the odd man in. I don't think I was ever the odd man out.
Clive Barnes, 28 years at the New York Post, 12 years at the New York Times. We wish you decades more in the dark on the aisle. Thanks for being our guest.
I'm all alone, all by myself. There is no one here beside me. I'm all alone, quite all alone. No one to comfort me or guide me. Why is there no one here with me on the long and winding road to lift my heavy load? If there was someone here with me, how happy I would be. But I'm alone.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theatre Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theatre Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
Playbill Online is the official website of Theatre Talk and the home of the Playbill Club, providing information and opportunities for theatre lovers. We welcome your questions or comments for Theatre Talk. Thank you and good night.